With any series or franchise, even if the various installments differ from each other, they will often remain connected by specific elements. Whether it's certain gameplay mechanics or deep-rooted thematic motifs, it's the combination of these specific elements that help to make said series or franchise unique. In the case of Final Fantasy, there are numerous examples such as the Warriors of Light, crystals, jobs, and even the recurring appearance of a character called Cid. But beyond that, one of the elements that's often cool and exciting for fans to see are the subtle nods to other properties, either from within that specific franchise itself or wider pop culture. Final Fantasy serves as a fantastic example of this, with plenty of references or Easter eggs baked into each game, and one such game in particular, Final Fantasy VII, features more than most. Today, we're going to run through some of the more curious examples, but to keep things interesting, we are only going to talk about references or Easter eggs that relate to other Final Fantasy games that were released before Final Fantasy VII. So, strap yourselves in as we take a look at some of the crazy Final Fantasy Easter eggs and references found within Final Fantasy VII, starting off with an interesting illusion found within the Bestiary. One of the most significant elements across the Final Fantasy franchise is its vast roster of recurring enemies. After their initial introduction, many would see their appearances evolve as they cemented themselves as staples within the franchise, with some popular examples being Malboras, Sahagins, and Behemoths. But amongst the collection of recurring enemies, there are numerous other enemies that by the time Final Fantasy VII was released hadn't managed to make that leap and remained unique to their respective games. Though many of these monsters would feature familiar design concepts such as being undead humanoids or quadrupeds, their names and particular characteristics would set them apart, such as the Death Rider from Final Fantasy II or Arachne from Final Fantasy IV. Each time these new monsters were introduced, they would need to be unique, and one of the most prominent examples of this was a curious group of monsters that were created for Final Fantasy V that were eerily dubbed the Unknown. Deformed and nefarious, despite each one featuring a distinct design and having planned names according to Tetsuya Nomura's concept art, within the final game, they would collectively be grouped together as the Unknown when they were encountered within the Great Sea Trench. It was a very weird concept, but it would resurface within Final Fantasy VII. After obtaining access to the submarine, the party would be able to encounter a hidden underwater dungeon, the Sunken Galnica, which had crashed while transporting some of Hojo's more abominable experiments. It would be within the Galnica that the party would be able to encounter a new selection of unknown beings. They were again designed by Tetsuya Nomura and were just as grotesque in their design as before. Tough to fight against, many would grind in the Sunken Galnica due to the sources the Unknown dropped, as they were designed to increase the attributes of the various party members. But this all tied together a bit too well to be anything other than a purposeful illusion, as not only was the name the same, as well as them being encountered underwater, the Unknown in Final Fantasy V would also drop drinks that would temporarily enhance a party's attributes. As a fun aside here, there's another Nomura design that had an eerie resemblance between Final Fantasy V and VII, but the connection wasn't quite the same. When attempting to ascend the Phoenix Tower, players would square off against Lemures, who were notoriously annoying due to the volume of status effects they could inflict upon the party. But one of the more interesting traits was the design used, as it had a striking resemblance to Aerith, even to the point that they both had long, wavy brown hair adorned with a pink ribbon. Whether or not the Lemures did stand to influence Aerith's design has never been confirmed, but it's always fun to speculate. One of the most memorable parts of Final Fantasy VII was attempting to acquire the Huge Materia. Described as enormous and extremely potent materia, the 4 known Huge Materia were formed within the heart of the Mako reactors scattered across the planet. When Meteor was summoned, it was believed the Huge Materia could help to neutralize the threat, so Cloud and his party, as well as Shinra, set out to gather as many as they could. The first 2 Huge Materia could be obtained from Coral and Fort Condor, with the last 2 associated with the submarine and the rocket ship. The challenge was that they were all missable and would each involve some kind of minigame. But if the player was successful in collecting all 4 of the Huge Materia, they would be placed within Bugenhagen's observatory. It was here that the players got to have a proper look at the Huge Materia. They would see, as the name denoted, that they were much larger than normal materia, and that they were unrefined and jagged. But what would have stood out even more were the colours. Each Huge Materia was a different colour: green, yellow, red and blue, and the aha moment here was that they were the exact same colours as the 4 elemental crystals in the original Final Fantasy. What's interesting, however, is that the connection to the crystals from Final Fantasy I did not end there, as the locations they were found in were also well aligned. For example, one could be found underwater at the bottom of the sea, just like the Sunken Shrine, and another could be found high in the sky, just like the Flying Fortress. The other 2 were a bit more tenuous. One could be found in Coral, which was of course a mining town but also had its own mountain, just like Mount Golg, and the remaining Huge Materia found at Fort Condor felt more like a symbolic reference, as the Cavern of Earth was the source of Melman's rot, but once the Earth Crystal was restored, it was revived and born anew, just like the Condor. The recurrence of names and certain narrative elements throughout the Final Fantasy series is almost a given. We mentioned Cid during the introduction, but it can also relate to names like Highwind and Sarah, as well as locations such as Mysidia. But perhaps one of the most interesting Easter eggs to exist with regards to naming could be found as the party ventured to the Gold Saucer, and it was related to a character who was fictional within the world of Final Fantasy VII. During the now infamous date sequence, which took place during the event square, if Cloud went on a date with Aerith, Tifa or Yuffie, the couple would be able to participate as the lead characters in a play. The story focused on the hero, called Alfred, who was played by Cloud, who resolved to rescue the princess, played by the chosen date, from the clutches of an evil villain. But it was the name of the princess that stood out as a curious callback, as her name was Princess Rosa, which served as a clear reference to Rosa from Final Fantasy IV. The illusion would not stop there, however. The main antagonist within the play, known as the evil Dragon King Valvados, also served as a potential reference to Cain Highwind, who kidnapped Rosa in the original game, and as the proverbial dragoon, he had a strong association with dragons. On the topic of fun name Easter eggs, some more obscured callbacks to other games included the Shildra Inn in Cosmo Canyon, which alluded to Sildra from Final Fantasy V, and the billboard plastered with Mount Colts in Midgar, referencing the location Mount Colts from Final Fantasy VI. Now, in most Final Fantasy games, the player's journey may not be considered complete without obtaining the game's most powerful weapons. In the first 5 installments in the franchise, these weapons were normally identified as such due to their high stats and availability towards the end of the game. But it wouldn't be until Final Fantasy VI that they were officially designated as Ultimate or Ultima weapons. This designation carried forward to Final Fantasy VII, but in a curious decision, so too did Ultima Weapon, one of the most powerful swords available in Final Fantasy VI. In its original incarnation, Ultima Weapon could only be wielded by Terra, Locke, Edgar, and Celes. It had the potential to deal incredible amounts of damage, but it had a specific mechanic that meant its damage would decrease in line with the wielder's current HP in relation to their maximum HP, something that would even be reflected by the length of the weapon changing. In Final Fantasy VII, Ultima Weapon could only be wielded by Cloud, but instead of just sharing the name like many other weapons had done before, it also retained those specific design quirks. It meant that Ultima Weapon's damage would decrease as Cloud took damage, and its design would adapt to reflect this, with the strength of the blade's glow becoming more dull. As an extension to this, with Final Fantasy VI also featuring a monster named Ultima Weapon or Atma Weapon depending on your localization preference, the developers decided to bring that forward too. Appearing as one of the expanded roster of weapons, Final Fantasy VII would feature Ultimate Weapon. But even though its name differed within the English localization, perhaps to avoid confusion, within the Japanese games, in Final Fantasy VI and VII, its name remained Ultima Weapon. Ever since Final Fantasy III, summons have been installed as one of the core recurring elements within the Final Fantasy franchise, as shown by them still having a major role to play within Final Fantasy XVI. Popular summons like Ifrit, Shiva, Ramu, Odin, and Bahamut are more often than not present within the roster. However, much like the enemies we spoke about earlier, even if many have failed to find a place within the legendary group, developers have often attempted to introduce new summons. Final Fantasy VI, for example, would introduce a huge array of new espers that included the likes of Alexander and Siren that did manage to become regular features. A similar approach was taken with Final Fantasy VII, as it featured a few new summons too, but one of them would end up being a very curious allusion back to Final Fantasy VI. One of the most memorable enemies featured throughout Final Fantasy VI was Ultros. It would be fought against numerous times, and in the final encounter it would bring a friend, Typhoon. And it was this friend who would then reappear in Final Fantasy VII, this time as a summon materia, featuring a nearly identical appearance. What's even more strange is that to extend this Easter egg, the opposite would also happen, as an Esper that originated in Final Fantasy VI would appear in Final Fantasy VII in a different form. When scouring through various pieces of mythology and folklore, the developers stumbled upon a piece of Irish folklore that spoke about Ketshi. It would end up being quite a weak Esper in Final Fantasy VI, obtained as part of the story, but for whatever reason, the developers decided to bring it forward, promoting Ketshi to being a playable character in Final Fantasy VII, complete with a very similar visual likeness, including the boots and cape. Sticking with the theme of summons, Final Fantasy VII would feature another illusion that paid specific reference to a mechanic seen within Final Fantasy V. By the time Final Fantasy VII had released, summons were gaining more traction as prominent features, but even though there were common elements, such as their elemental affinities and their ultimate moves, they were still reasonably unique from entry to entry, as opposed to being direct clones. And that's what makes the appearances of Odin and Chocomog rather interesting, as their gameplay mechanics were identical between Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VII. Unlike many of the other summons featured in Final Fantasy V, Odin and Chocobo had the move they performed determined by luck or circumstance. Odin, for example, would perform Zantetsuken the majority of the time, but would switch to using Gunge Lance when encountering foes that were invulnerable to instant death. Likewise, Chocobo would have a 92% chance of performing Chocobo Kick, but an 8% chance of performing Fat Chocobo, which had 150% more power. In Final Fantasy VII, these functions were retained. If the target was immune to instant death, Odin would perform Gunge Lance instead of Zantetsuken, and there was a 93.75% chance that Chocomog would perform Death Blow instead of Fat Chocobo, which still dealt more damage, although it was only moderately more this time. Although Gunge Lance and Gungnir would appear within other games, these are the only two major instances where Odin will adapt automatically should the enemy be immune. And that brings us onto our last entry, which will discuss why Vincent Valentine is basically a walking reference to both the history of the franchise, but also wider pop culture. When Final Fantasy VII was in the early stages of development, the playable cast were initially assigned specific jobs. For example, Cloud was planned to be a Mystic Knight, Barrett a Gunner, Aerith a Geomancer, and so on. And though the final product would ultimately scrap the formal job system, the characters would still retain some mechanics, abilities, and attributes based on these initial classes. In the case of Vincent Valentine, he was initially designated the class Horror Terror or Horror Researcher. This would work in with his placement within the narrative, as Vincent was at one point planned to be a detective who investigated supernatural phenomena. Much of this would be cut away, as the development team attempted to still include Vincent as an optional character. It would see him rewritten as a former Turk who slumbered within the Shinra mansion, but one of the initial concepts of his backstory would be fully realised, as, via his limit break, Vincent retained the ability to transform into different types of monster. But what's interesting is that each of Vincent's limit break forms would make reference to various things seen within the Final Fantasy franchise and beyond. The first limit break was the Galleon Beast, and when used, Vincent would mutate into what largely resembled a classic behemoth. Its primary colour was purple, and Vincent would grow huge horns, traditional features seen with behemoths in Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI, and its design was very closely aligned with the regular behemoths in Final Fantasy VII. Moreover, the magical ability of the Galleon Beast was Beast Flare, which corresponded well with behemoths often using Flare as their strongest move in retaliation to the party using magic. Vincent's second transformation, Death Gigas, could be compared to Barnabas from Final Fantasy IV. Death Gigas and Barnabas were both highly reminiscent of Frankenstein's monster. The connection to Barnabas also extended to the backstory, as just like Vincent, who ended up having these abilities due to the despicable deeds of Professor Hojo, Barnabas was the creation of Dr. Lugay. Vincent's third limit break, Hellmasker, seemed to be more of a pop culture reference to classic horror movies. It would see the Hellmasker don iconic horror media elements such as the ski mask and the chainsaw. Furthermore, in Tetsuya Nomura's concept artwork for this particular form, Vincent wore a shirt that said "Living Dead" in English, a potential nod to his undead-like nature and his previous actor sleeping in a coffin, as well as the hit movie franchise. Vincent's final transformation, Chaos, would then serve as one of the most obvious references. Like the original Chaos, who appeared as the main antagonist in Final Fantasy I, when transformed, Vincent would have similar fiendish qualities of wings and horns. Though their names and visual aesthetics seem to be only shared elements between them, Dirge Cerberus would expand the lore and backstory of Vincent's Chaos, illustrating both entities as being born of negativity and destined to bring some sort of end to the world. Through the introduction of Omega, it was also revealed that Chaos was linked to the concept of immortality, just like the original Chaos had been many years before. And with that, I think we're done. There were 7 cool Final Fantasy Easter eggs and references found within Final Fantasy VII. We'd love to hear which one was your favourite, as well as some of the more bizarre Easter eggs you've come across. Share with us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give us a like and hit the subscribe button. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory and Z-Dawn, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.